everyone, and welcome to the first edition of Coach's Comments. My name is Brittany Stanchik. I'm a congressional debate coach at Desert Vista High School in Phoenix, Arizona. If you want to know more about me, you can check out my bio on the website. I just wanted to introduce myself right now so you know who's talking to you. The purpose of these videos is to help you as a debater either learn certain skills, get a different viewpoint of these skills, or enhance your skills in session with the content that we're talking about. If you're a coach, the same aspect applies because the information can still be utilized. It's just going to be from your interpretation of how you choose to teach it to your debaters. So in this video, we're going to be talking about refutation in speeches. There is a difference between refutation speeches and refutation in speeches. Refutation speeches we'll cover in another video, so for the sake of today, we'll just talk about how to utilize refutation in your speeches. The burden of refutation increases as you move through debate. You can think of congressional debate similar as you would a round of public forum debate. You have your constructive phase, your refutation phase, and then your crystallization phase. That being the constructive speeches, the first refutation speeches, the summary, and then the final focus. That same aspect applies here. So a few speeches in, when you hear little to no reference of other debaters or other arguments made in the round, something's obviously wrong. That's what we're trying to fix with refutation in speeches, and that's what you need to aim to utilize. So refutation in speeches falls between constructive-based speeches and refutation-based speeches. So you're not going to be giving a speech entirely about refutation, but you're obviously going to be tearing down some of the arguments that have come before you. Let's talk about the number one mistake that congressional debaters make when it comes to refutation. And that's that they reference other arguments, they don't respond to them. When you reference an argument, you say what that argument is. So Mr. Smith argued that human rights abuses are occurring in China. That would be referencing the argument. Most people leave it at that. To respond to an argument means you explain why that argument is false. So not just what the argument is, but why it's wrong. So your follow-up would be, Mr. Smith says that human rights abuses are occurring in China. That's false because of X, Y, and Z. Make sure that you're responding as opposed to just referencing, or that completely undermines the purpose of refutation in your speech. Flowing, speaking of which, is vitally important because referencing arguments as opposed to responding to them occurs when you don't know what the argument is. Flowing is covered in another one of these videos, but if you don't know what flowing is, it's writing down the other arguments from the other speeches that have been stated and presented in session. If you don't flow or you're kind of loose with flowing, that's okay, but you should pay detailed attention through listening, obviously, to what those other arguments are, so when it comes to responding to them, your response is accurate and worthy. Another aspect that's very, very important before we go into different types of refutation and what to refute is you need to ensure that you are not attacking the person, rather you're attacking the argument. Congressional debate can get very heated because you obviously interact with each other. There should not be, Mr. Jordan, you're wrong. There should be, Mr. Jordan, your argument's wrong, or your argument is false. You want to keep the civility and respect alive in this event. So let's talk about what aspects of the argument you can refute. Before we go on to the different entities that you can attack, remember that there are some arguments that are not worth responding to. That doesn't mean you should just shove off every kind of argument that comes that you don't have a response to or you don't think is worthy, but pay attention to what's going on in the debate. Oftentimes on bills or resolutions even, negative speakers will propose an alternative or a counter plan. Sometimes they get a bit tangent-like. They go off on multiple different reasons that really don't have anything to do with the topic. That may not be worth responding to, and if it is, don't spend super long on it because you want to spend time on good refutation. So aspects that you can refute. You can start with the claim. We're breaking apart an argument here. So we'll go through different entities. The claim that you respond to is the most common. It's the most general, condensed version of the argument. So that usually includes the warrant, the data, and the impacts all in one. That's easiest to reference. That is perfectly acceptable and obviously encouraged as long as you're explaining some brief synopsis behind that argument. When we also refer to referencing, we mean explaining what that argument was. If you say Mr. Smith said something like this, that's not clear. We're not going to understand when you refute. So besides your claim, you can also attack the warrant. The warrant is your backing to that claim, the reason why it's true. Obviously, if you take down the warrant, which oftentimes backs or goes hand in hand with the claim, that demeans the general argument, which again is the claim that most often is responded to. Next, you can attack the data. This is the evidence or the analytical evidence, if it's your own reasoning, of the point. When you refute evidence, most of the time you're not going to be refuting the evidence itself, but rather the function of that. So if Mr. Brown's content, evidence, was incorrect, what does that mean then for the debate? It often means that that argument is false, all right, and then you would link that to the greater aspect of the debate, which we'll talk about in links at the end of this lecture. Besides that, you have your impact, obviously. That makes up the final aspect of your argument. The purpose and magnitude, right, that comes with an impact is incredibly important to debate because it talks about your consequences. All right, if you refute and tear down that impact, there's little credibility or significance behind that argument. Then there's more of a reason not to vote in that side of the debate and stand with you on your side. Questions can also be discussed or refuted in speeches, but that will be covered in the questioning video, which is further down the road. So general responses, that will vary by the use of your content. These are often just vague, broad kind of references that coaches or other debaters can make to each other if they're flowing and going over drills. Those references are the ones that I'm making now, so they're very clean cut and I'm not using any examples of speeches here. So the first is to prove it inaccurate, all right, to prove that claim false. This is the most common type of argument, obviously, because if their argument is not correct, that's less of a reason to vote for them. Besides inaccuracy, you can turn the argument. When I refer to turning an argument, it means to prove the opposite true, or the opposite of that argument or of that impact is true. For example, if an affirmative speech argues that a certain kind of impact would happen, that could be turned. The negative speech or a negative speaker could say that we could still achieve that impact under the negative world, all right, if we negate. The next kind of argument you can make is to say that their argument is exaggerated. So there may be some sort of truth to it, but 90% of it or 80% of it or a majority of it is false. They've exaggerated that information. And as a result, it means their impacts or some other form of refutation or implication doesn't hold as much weight and it's not as important. You can argue that it's outdated. This will primarily come with evidence. If they're quoting something from 2 years ago and it's dealing with Syria, obviously lots of different things and events have occurred in Syria, and that evidence won't take role or priority in the debate. You can talk about weighing, or rather outweighing. To weigh means that you explain the importance of something and why it's more important. So an argument in the affirmative or an impact in the affirmative is more important than one of the negative because X, Y, and Z, that's obviously your reasoning and your content. Besides that, you can argue that arguments are non-unique. In other words, when we talked about earlier how sometimes negative speakers provide alternatives or counter plans, if those have little link or they're just not very good, you can argue that they're not important. They're non-unique because they don't provide any solution to the argument at hand. If you are going to group arguments or debaters, perfectly acceptable, because oftentimes multiple debaters will either make the same argument, which is rehash, or make some certain aspect of a similar argument in their speech. Awesome. Feel free to group them because it gains you more ground because you get to respond to more arguments, but make sure you're clear. Don't just list off name after name after name. Be clear and slow with the names that you're grouping so the judge is able to understand them. So we just covered what to refute. Now let's talk about where to refute. In your introduction, feel free to reference what speakers in the opposition or even your own side, but that's not really refutation, have discussed. What you don't want to do in an introduction is make a full-out argument against another person's, all right, or another advocacy. The reason why is because you'll have little time to analyze it. Your introduction serves its own purpose, and that's not to refute an entire advocacy, because you won't have time to discuss your reasoning. You want to do that in point. Speaking of which, in point, in contention, you have two different types of refutation that you can make. You can make early refutation and late refutation. When I refer to early refutation, I mean refutation that falls right at the beginning of your argument, be it before you even get to the claim, if you started off in your transition, or right after the claim, or right after the warrant. This is usually best or preferable by most debaters because then they can spend the rest of their argument using their warrant and their data as a response to that argument. So it just fits better and makes a little bit more sense in terms of linking. If you're going to use early refutation, make sure you follow up and you link at the very end of that point. So if you started off by saying, Miss Brown, you argue X, Y, and Z, say that's false, go into your claim, warrant, you're somewhat mentioning her name throughout the data. At the end of that data, or at the end of the impact, you need to say because of this or because X, Y, and Z, your argument falls or is wrong. You need to make sure that you're following up to provide that clarity and that solid and full amount of refutation. Late refutation falls at the end of a point. Oftentimes it comes because debaters just didn't know to put it at the beginning, or because it's still relevant and they still want to respond to that argument, but it doesn't necessarily have a perfect place. Obviously, perfectly acceptable also. What you do want to do, though, is make sure that you're providing clarity into that refutation. Oftentimes, something as simple as a brief pause to indicate a change in your levels can lead you straight into refutation. It makes your judges aware that you're moving on, and it's easier to follow. That being said, because pace can sometimes become an issue and you're trying to cover as much as you can, if you don't have time to pause or you're not comfortable with it, make sure you use a transition word such as in addition or simply Mr. Brown said X, something to indicate that you're moving forward. There's something called a +1 in terms of refutation. So if you're not referencing or you're not refuting in the introduction or in point, you can have a tiny third point or a tiny fourth point if you're using a three-pronged structure. Oftentimes these +1s deal with arguments that are still very important in the round, but maybe don't require like a small amount of significance in response. So they're at least 30 seconds, it's super important, but you don't have time to put them in a point. That's perfectly okay. After your second point is over, walk into what would look like a conclusion, but make sure you're providing some sort of clear transition and claim. Same as you would with the other early refutation and late refutation aspects, make sure you're following up, explaining why that argument was so important that we needed to focus on it. Remember the burden of refutation as we move through the debate. So if you're the first negative, which is the first speech after the authorship or sponsorship, or first affirmative, which is the first speech after the first negative. There should be lots of refutation, but only against one person. Obviously, if you have refutation in there, maybe one or two responses, that's perfectly okay, but don't be afraid if you have more time to lay a little bit more down. Oftentimes, those early speeches debaters want because it gives you good precedence and recency, but it means a little bit less refutation. So don't be afraid to lay it on heavy, so to speak, but again, make sure you're being respectful in that you're referencing and responding to their arguments, not them. If you're in later speeches, and debaters technically usually love these because they get to refute more, fantastic. But make sure you're talking about the arguments that you're responding to. So if you're the ninth negative and you're refuting the second affirmative speech, you need to take us all the way back to that speech to explain why you're responding to it. Oftentimes it's because other debaters who have gone before you haven't responded to it. That's obviously an acceptable thing to say, but make sure you walk your judge through that. Let's talk about clarity now in terms of refutation. This is really just a matter of getting the judge to follow along with what you're talking about. So when you do refute, wherever it may be, you need to present refutation the same way as you normally would an argument. So, Mr. Jordan, you argued X. That's the clear transition, it's the first claim. Fantastic. Then you need to give your response. That's false because X, or that's exaggerated because Y. Then you would go into your data. You don't have to follow the structure of claim, warrant, data, impact. That's up to you. But there does need to be some clarity in there so the judge can follow. Okay? The last thing that we'll talk about in this video are links. So as soon as you're done with your refutation, explaining why their argument was wrong or is wrong or has been exaggerated, whatever your response may be, you need to link it back to what's going on in the round. All right, you can think about this in terms of offense or defense. So if their argument is wrong, why is that good for your advocacy, for your side? Or if their argument is wrong, what does it mean for their side? You want to link it back into the advocacies. Most of the time, if an argument is wrong, it usually means that they lose ground in some aspect. If they do, explain what that means for the debate. That clarity for the judge and for other debaters will not only help you stick out, but it will help arguments in the round and refutation progress a lot more. Oftentimes, debaters make the same mistake of not only responding to the same arguments, but making the same arguments in response because they haven't been paying close attention or because the responses weren't clear enough. So refutation in speeches is obviously something that is used by congressional debaters. Whether you struggle with it or you think that you're the best at it, you can still get better. And you should get better by practicing. Just keep in mind the content that we've talked about during this lecture and use it moving forward in the other videos that we may have.